from my perspective, Trudeau is getting what he deserved. The problem is that Canadians are not going to get what they deserve because only somebody like Pierre Poilievre is going to take over. And the reason for that is that any seriously left-wing alternative is not given any chance.
The fundamental problem, Radhika, with the political system in this country is that we don't have a democracy. But we effectively have one party that represents the oligarchy, and it's divided into two factions.
Hello and welcome to the 40th Geopolitical Economy Hour, the show that brings you the fast-changing political and geopolitical economy of our time. I'm Radhika Desai, your host, and working behind the scenes to bring you this show every fortnight or more frequently is Paul Graham, our videographer, and Eklavya Jain, our transcriber. And of course, there's also Ben Norton, our host on Geopolitical Economy Report. The world regards Canada as nice and boring. Nothing exciting happens there. But over the last couple of months, things have been very different. On the one hand, within a week or two of being elected, President-elect Trump started issuing threats against Canada. Threats about tariffs, threats about undertaking all sorts of measures because Canada was not helping reduce illegal immigration into the US. And of course, the threat about making Canada the 51st state, which he issued first by calling Trudeau, Prime Minister Trudeau, Governor Trudeau. On the other hand, we have seen that Prime Minister Trudeau has resigned over the last less than 2 weeks ago. And this, of course, has put Canadian politics into a churn. This means that if you thought Canada was boring and nice, you've seen nothing yet, because it's about to get interesting and nasty. Trudeau clung on to the last minute, leaving when he had absolutely no choice, when a mauling by the parliamentary party as well as by his own party membership was practically inevitable. We have, on the other hand, a Trumpist prime minister in waiting, Pierre Poilievre, who became the leader of the Conservative Party, hot on the heels of the Freedom Convoy, which occupied Ottawa in January 2022, and displaced the previous Conservative Party leader. And he is practically set to win the next election. Moreover, the other really interesting thing from an international point of view is that Trudeau's resignation is essentially the fall of the showboy of the international, globalist, Atlanticist, so-called democratic alliance of leaders, which Biden created in the wake of the 2022 Russian incursion into Ukraine. Now, this means that he's only the latest of globalists to fall. And as people know, the German government of Olaf Scholz fell within hours of Trump's victory. France's Barnier government and South Korea's Yoon government, which ironically tried to defend democracy by imposing martial law, followed within the month. And of course, Trudeau is the latest. So what does all this mean? What are we to make of it? What does it mean for Canada? What does it mean for the world? This is what we want to explore today. And with me to explore it is Dimitri Lascaris. Dmitri is one of the most important public figures in Canada. He is a journalist, he is a lawyer, and a campaigning lawyer to boot, and even more importantly, he's a politician. He's the politician that ran for the first time for the Canadian Parliament in 2015, the year Trudeau was first made Prime Minister. And he recalls from that time that people said to him, why should he run for the Green Party, which he did, and not for Trudeau, given how wonderfully progressive Trudeau was? And Dmitri told them exactly, he essentially predicted what would happen, which is that Trudeau would disappoint on climate change and Trudeau would disappoint on electoral reform, among many other things. Dmitri also ran for the leadership of the Green Party of Canada on an eco-socialist ticket. And he would have won had it not been for the fact that the establishment of the Green Party attacked him for being anti-Semitic simply because he supported the Palestinian cause. So welcome, Dimitri. It's a great pleasure to have you on this show.
Thank you for inviting me, my friend. It's good to talk to you always.
Great. So let's start this off, Dimitri. Why don't you tell us a little bit about exactly, exactly how the media has been covering Trudeau's resignation, what it's been saying, and what's good and bad about it?
Well, the media's discussion about this issue is studiously avoiding sort of the underlying realities about Canadian politics. And without addressing that, the conversation within the media is likely to be nothing but it's not going to solve anything. It's simply going to perpetuate the problems. We have to start by recognizing the underlying causes of the massive discontent that has led to the demise of Trudeau. The fundamental problem, Radhika, with the political system in this country is that we don't have a democracy. What we have is a uniparty, and this is a phenomenon that we see across the West today, and it's been the case for decades now. No one in the mainstream media, so-called mainstream media, wants to talk about it, but we effectively have one party that represents the oligarchy, and it's divided into two factions. They agree on the vast majority of issues that matter to Canadians. So, for example, they agree that we should have increased military spending. They agree that Canada should be part of NATO. They agree that Canada should pursue these so-called free trade agreements, which ultimately undermine the interests of Canadian workers. They agree that our society should tolerate a situation in which you have a handful of people controlling tens of billions of dollars of wealth and hundreds of thousands of people living in the streets. And I could go on and on. What they disagree on is relatively unimportant to the vast majority of Canadians, their day-to-day lives. And so every electoral cycle, what happens is people build up frustration. The electorate, particularly the working class, they build up frustration about the refusal of the political elite, the governing elite, to address their concerns. And they opt for a change, and they're told that this is your best option. No one else has a realistic opportunity to win. So if you want change, this is really all you can vote for. And they invariably, the vast majority of voters fall for the shtick, and they vote in another faction of the Uni-Party. And then several years later, they find out that they actually were not prepared to deliver real change after all. And we've been going through this vicious cycle over and over again, and we're witnessing it one more time. Trudeau came in saying Canada's back. He was going to change fundamentally Canadian society after, I believe it was 7 years of immense frustration with the extreme right-wing government of Stephen Harper. And the fact of the matter is that although he put a softer touch on some elements of Canadian economic and foreign policy, fundamentally he didn't change anything. And in fact, he even deepened I would say, our servitude to the United States. And so people now are waking up. They started waking up, I think, in the last election, where, as I recall, Trudeau actually lost the popular vote, but nonetheless managed to win more seats. So the writing was already on the wall then. And the only reason why he survived up until now is that the sellouts in the NDP have propped him up, which they are, by the way, going to pay a price for in the next coming election, I believe. But he's managed to prolong his pointless tenure as Prime Minister, where he's really not done anything to address the fundamental problems in this country. By entering into this coalition with this marriage of convenience with the NDP, and Canadians are now so fed up that they're going to turf him out of office. But by all indications, Radhika, they're going to repeat the same mistake they've been repeating for decades. They're going to opt for the other faction of the Uni-Party. Sad to say. Now we can get into the granularity of it, what specifically is frustrating Canadians, but I think it's important to begin the conversation there, to look overall at what it is that keeps generating this unaddressed frustration in the Canadian population, which we're seeing now in quite vivid terms.
And, since we're talking about the really big picture, it seems to me that even more than Harper, what's now going to come with Pierre Poilievre, who is, at least from present indications, is likely to win the next election, what he represents is actually an even more right-wing version of the neoliberal politics that we've seen under Trudeau. The issue with Trudeau and his ilk, and I'll come back to what that ilk is, because there is actually an extensive international alliance, but we'll come back to that. But the problem with Trudeau and his ilk is that they think that they can hide their neoliberalism behind a sort of fig leaf, a very tiny fig leaf, of policies that sound progressive but are actually completely tokenistic. So they propose to do something for women or for indigenous people or for immigrants or non-white people, etc., by simply appointing a handful of them to prominent positions. And of course, that handful is carefully chosen in order to make sure that they are more pious than the Pope as far as neoliberalism is concerned. And then, of course, they claim that, they are progressive, they are feminist, they are, anti-racist, and, in favor of indigenous reconciliation and all of that thing. But they, in fact, don't actually deliver for the vast majority of the members of this group. So that is but at the same time, what you now are going to see in Canada is an even more unapologetic version of neoliberalism combined with a kind of really aggressive right-wing politics, which will say that, well, we don't care about, this kind of feminism or anti-racism or what have you, because it's just tokenism, and we are going to insist on the rights of Canadians to be who they are, which in their definition means the white community, etc., etc. We're going to clamp down on immigration, blah, blah, and so on. So these are the things we're going to see. So in one sense, in a certain sense, from my perspective, Trudeau is getting what he deserved. The problem is that Canadians are not going to get what they deserve because only somebody like Pierre Poilievre is going to take over. And the reason for that is that any seriously left-wing alternative is not given any chance. Dimitri, you experienced this already when you ran for the leadership of the Green Party in 2020. We have seen in the last year or so, and all full disclosure, Dimitri and I certainly promised to work for Jill Stein and did a little bit of work for Jill Stein. But, candidates like her were the only serious alternative. But the establishment, the two-party establishment, essentially ensured that she would not even get on the ballot in many states, or get on the ballot in only very compromised circumstances. And so there was absolutely no way that an alternative can emerge. So this is another difficulty. And, this, of course, your opening position that this is just a duopoly reminds me, of course, of the quotation generally attributed to Nyerere, but we don't know whether he actually said it. But Julius Nyerere is supposed to have said, when he was accused of running a one-party state in Tanzania, that America, meaning the United States, is also a one-party state. But with typical American extravagance, they have two of them. So there we have it. So yeah, I mean, this is definitely a serious issue. And you were going to talk about, I think we should talk a little bit about how the media is covering it, because it looks as though the media has essentially decided that Trudeau, that Poilievre is going to win, and practically every major mainstream media outlet is essentially talking about how Trudeau is hated. So maybe you can say something about it. But before that, I'll simply say, of course, that I forgot to mention earlier that Dmitri, as you see behind him, runs a wonderful new YouTube show, a YouTube channel called Reason to Resist. And I'm sure you should all check him out on that, because he doesn't just cover Canada there, he covers a whole range of world issues. But Dmitri, why don't you talk about how the media has been covering Trudeau's departure?
Well, I think they're making it a lot about personality. So they're saying, Trudeau is detached. Trudeau comes off as arrogant. The Canadian people, we hear this all the time. They're tired. They want to change. But no one ever addresses the underlying concerns. They're making this very much about the carbon tax. The corporate media, which is so heavily under the influence of the fossil fuels industry in this country, want you to believe that That is a huge part of the reason for discontent, even though the carbon tax has had, from an economic perspective, really very little impact on ordinary Canadians. So they want the carbon tax, the corporate media, to be ditched. So they're making it all about that. And of course, the Liberal candidates are dutifully complying. Now we're hearing from the two leading candidates in the Liberal Party to replace Trudeau, Chrystia Freeland and Mark Carney, the former Bank of Canada and Bank of England governor, that they are going to scale back dramatically the carbon tax. We're hearing this also from the other Liberal candidate who has, frankly, little hope of winning, Chandra Arya. He's going to ditch the carbon tax. It's really not about the carbon tax. There is some level of concern amongst certainly right-leaning Canadians about that. But the broader population, I don't think, is particularly motivated by that. So what they're avoiding talking about, and the things that I think are really generating frustration for people in this country, first of all, is the unaffordability of housing. There has been a dramatic increase in the Canadian population under Trudeau. I checked the Canadian population for reasons unrelated to this broadcast the other day and was surprised to learn it's now hit 40 million. It's in excess of 40 million. I thought it was 38 million. 2 million people were added to the population, and Canada's government didn't take steps to increase the stock of housing, affordable housing for the population. These people could have been accommodated if Canada had made the appropriate investments, but it didn't. And so that is something that is of great concern to Canadians, the unaffordability of housing. Another thing that is really frustrating to Canadians is the degradation of our public healthcare system. The Trudeau government did virtually nothing to address those concerns. And in fact, we've seen increasing creeping privatization of the healthcare system in this country, a process which the Poilievre government, should he come to power, will undoubtedly accelerate. So that problem is going to get worse. I think another source of discontent amongst Canadians, and certainly the corporate media doesn't want to talk about this, is the fact that Canada shipped almost $20 billion to Ukraine at a time when poverty and homelessness in this country were becoming more severe. In whatever the official statistics may show, we're seeing every day more and more people homeless in this country. A report came out, not a governmental report, a non-governmental report, that showed that the population of the homeless in Ontario, Canada's most populous province, was in 2024 in excess of 80,000 persons, and that they predicted that if there is a significant economic downturn, that number will soar to well in excess of 200,000 people. That's just in Ontario. So we're probably looking right now at a level of homelessness in this country involving hundreds of thousands of people. Hundreds of thousands of people every year are at some point or another homeless. The government is doing nothing significant to address that, but at the same time is shipping $20 billion to a failed proxy war in Ukraine. So I think these are some of the issues that, and of course, inequality. People see, that while so many Canadians are struggling just to, and with huge amounts of debt, struggling to deal with the costs of living, struggling to deal with their healthcare needs and so forth, that more and more wealth is being concentrated in the hands of a very small number of extremely privileged Canadians who effectively control, the political system in this country and the corporate media. So these frustrations are building, and what happens, people end up, as we've seen over and over again in history, scapegoating vulnerable members of the population. And that's happening in Canada, just as it's happening in the United States and happening in Europe. Racialized groups are being blamed at the behest of the political elite for problems that are really the making of the political elite, that are the fault of the political elite. And the corporate media doesn't want to talk about that at all. And the other thing I wanted to say briefly, Radhika, when we talked about, how difficult it is for a truly radical alternative to come to power in this country, we need to understand that the leadership of the two alternatives, the so-called left-wing alternatives in Canada's parliament, serve a very specific function in Canada's political system, and that function is to act as gatekeepers. And you and I experienced this in the 2020 leadership campaign. Their purpose is to prevent anyone with a radical transformative agenda from assuming power in their party and offering a real alternative to Canadians. They perpetuate the myth that they are an alternative by placing themselves slightly to the left of the Liberals. That's what the NDP does, and that's what the Greens do. So, for example, the NDP and the Greens, they favor a wealth tax, right? But if you look at the actual proposal, it's peanuts. It's not going to fundamentally alter the problem of inequality in this country. We used to have in Canada in the 50s and the 60s a top marginal tax rate that was in excess of 90%. 90%. That would actually be a real change and a real effort to address the problem of yawning inequality in this country. You know as well as I do, Radhika, that the leadership of the Greens and the NDP wouldn't even think about floating that idea for purposes of debate and discussion. That's far too radical for them. So they come up with this little band-aid of a solution. It's no solution at all. This pathetic wealth tax, and that is enough to position themselves as an alternative to the Liberals, as a progressive alternative to liberals, but at the end of the day, they are not.
No,
So this is the game they're playing in the public discourse in this country.
absolutely. I mean, when you say that Canada had a 90% marginal tax rate at the highest bracket, I mean, people might think, oh, the Canadian government must have been heavily, a big taxing government. It was the norm for Western countries to have those sorts of taxes because the general idea was, and it directly came from the fact that working class people at that time were very empowered. They had fought, they had helped their governments fight wars, they had come home as heroes. The idea was that this was going to be a society fit for heroes, etc., etc. So you had a very different society. And now and over the last, I would say, 40 plus years, 45 years even, depending on which country you're talking about, all of these arrangements that made our society so much more livable, so much more fair, so much more just. It was not the ultimate. There was still a long way to go, but it was way better than what we have. But when the crisis of the 1970s occurred, people, one way of looking at it would have been that we can come out of this crisis by deepening the progressive reforms after the Second World War and say, create greater equality, put more money into the pockets of ordinary people so they will have more, create more demand, etc. But no, the side that won said that no, we should reverse all those reforms that we undertook that would liberate capital from all the social obligations and political obligations that it had, and somehow this would be free capital to undertake investment, and capital would reacquire its mojo and so on. That is not what has happened, because quite frankly, capital is simply not capable of doing that. However, as you say, all the major political forces of the country have bought this, they have drunk this Kool-Aid. So the Mulroney Conservatives first moved to the right, but the Liberals and the NDP have followed them there. So now we have this cross-party consensus on neoliberalism. And therefore, when you said earlier, that the coverage is all about, how bad, Trudeau is fake and phony and, was all these things, is imposing this terrible carbon tax and bringing in more immigrants and so on. All these people, essentially, they are attacking Trudeau in his sort of soft underbelly. Why do I call it the soft underbelly? Because of the two sides of this one party that we're talking about. Trudeau's side, the so-called liberal or Bidenite side, if we might call them, essentially wins elections by claiming to be more progressive than they are. And of course, by attacking them for being progressive from the other side is the way the other side wins. So that's the situation we have right now. So the falsity of Trudeau, the fact that he overpromises and underdelivers, is a structural feature of this system, is what I wanted to say. But you also
100%.
Sorry, please go ahead.
No, I'm in total agreement with you. I didn't mean to interrupt.
Yeah, no. But yeah, exactly. And the stuff about immigration, you said that you looked up some figures. So did I, because I recently did a piece on this. I also did a piece on Trudeau, but that's a different matter. But I did a piece on the Sidecar website, and it's about Trudeau's departure. And for that, I did look up the immigration figures. And essentially what happened is that, of course, the Harper average was about 250,000 a year. Under Trudeau, for most of the time after 2015, it was like 300,000 a year. An increase, but not huge. But essentially what happened, and this is the way in which the Trudeau government relates to the corporate establishment of Canada. Essentially, what happened is that after the COVID-19 restrictions ended and the service economy took off, there was an enormous increase in demand for unskilled labor, service sector
Mhm.
labor. And so Trudeau did two things. He, first of all, or his government, expanded the Harper era temporary workers program, in which essentially workers are tied to one employer. And he expanded in cahoots with the Canadian, underfunded Canadian universities, the International Student Program. So, under these two programs, lots more people came in. And you're absolutely right. When I looked up the figures, it was essentially about 490,000 and or thereabouts for each of the 2 years, 2022 and 2023. So yes, of course, the country experienced a huge influx of people for which it was not prepared. The Poilievre side keeps claiming that it's immigrants that are the problem. Immigrants are not the problem. That simple fact. Immigrants are not the problem, unfortunately or fortunately. They are the solution. They are the solution because Canada's birth rate is at an all-time, is very low. There is absolutely
Mhm.
no way that Canada can grow in any way and have an adequate labor force that is capable of taking care of those who cannot work, whether they are too elderly or whether they are too young or disabled or what have you. And so you need an influx of immigrants. But the problem is that they have essentially they brought in these immigrants without providing the services. There's not just a housing crisis, but there is also a crisis in healthcare services, social services, etc. And so naturally the people there are irate, and this irritation is used by the likes of Poilievre to attack Trudeau on migration, etc., etc. So
Right,
this is
right.
the kind of situation we have, and we're going to see for the in the upcoming election campaign is going to be pretty ugly, because essentially you're going to have Trudeau, or whoever's, rather not Trudeau, but whoever succeeds him, whether it's Chrystia Freeland or Mark Carney. I don't think it hardly matters, because I don't think either of them is going to win. And the fact that they are willing to lead the Liberal Party at this low point must mean that they are simply gluttons for punishment, because I don't see them going anywhere.
Well, that's
And
that's one possibility. The other is they have such gigantic egos that they think that they can somehow pull a rabbit out of the hat and
I
transform a Liberal
suppose.
into a
You
winner.
know what? I never even thought about it, but of course, that's absolutely a possibility. And,
Right.
I just wanted to add one other thing about this whole issue of Trudeau's progressiveness. I remember when Trudeau was elected in 2015 in the election campaign, and I even remember writing a newspaper column in the Winnipeg Free Press, basically saying that there was, nothing wrong with increasing government spending, particularly given that interest rates were so low at that time, and so on. So, defending this idea and saying that, it's a good thing that the Trudeau, the Liberals are essentially saying that we don't have to adhere to this crazy a deficit obsession, except of but so they sounded, as you said, very progressive. But the thing is that even after all that noise about, we are going to be progressive, we are going to create investment, we are going to invest in social services, blah blah and so on, their most progressive policy, which everybody agree, or rather, let me put it this way: most people would say that the most progressive thing that the Trudeau government did from 2015 to today is introduce the national child benefit, and it is supposed to have brought about 500,000 kids out of poverty, but it still left Canadian child poverty rate at about 17% a few years ago, and 2 or 3 years ago, and since then it has gone up by about 5 percentage points. So you can see, if this is what their most progressive policy has done, you can see how completely disappointing this government has been. And this is part of this whole structural feature, that they are necessarily how can you say, they must necessarily betray, they must necessarily promise the world and deliver neoliberalism. That's what I wanted to say.
Right. And the fact that I think that the fact that Carney and Freeland have emerged as by far the two leading candidates to replace Trudeau tells you all you need to know about the orientation of the Liberals. Mark Carney is a former Goldman Sachs banker. And then he went on to become the head of the Bank of Canada, after which he assumed the position of governor of the Bank of England, pursuing neoliberal policies there. This is a man of privilege, a man who sees the world very much through the eyes of the affluent and prioritizes their interests. And Chrystia Freeland, as I recall, she was had an editorial position at the Financial Times. Her specialty was basically glorifying billionaires. That's what her unique talent as a so-called journalist was. And she's made very clear in her time as Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister what her economic orthodoxy is and what her geopolitical orientation is. She's a neocon. She's a neocon who will do the bidding of the military-industrial complex at every turn. These are the two candidates to replace Trudeau. This is where the Liberals believe that they are going to find the electoral promised land by putting one of these two people at the head of their party. I mean, it's just a reaffirmation of the fact that we have a uniparty of big business, of the billionaire class, with two factions. The Liberals have learned nothing, and that's because they have no interest in learning anything from the imminent demise of their government. They aren't there in order to serve the interests of the people at the end of the day. One of the things I want to mention about how they convince Canadians they're progressives, by the way, you mentioned the child care benefit. That is, I would say, probably the most significant progressive achievement of their government, although grossly inadequate to address the underlying needs and concerns of the workers of this country. They made a big deal during their time in office of championing the rights of the LGBTQ community. And something I want to say about that is that that is a cheap way to come off as progressive, because when you champion the rights of the LGBTQ community, it doesn't require you to fundamentally redistribute wealth in the country. It's kind of from the perspective of the wealthy, it's a cost-free way to look progressive. Okay. So that's why they do it. And that's why they place so much emphasis upon it, because they can project the image of being progressive without actually changing the underlying structural problems of our society. So people, I think, our comrades in the LGBT community should be cognizant of that. Of course, they have every reason to, favor and promote political candidates who are going to respect their rights. But they are also at times being cynically exploited by the neoliberals, and even sometimes people on the right, and by the business community. You go to the Gay Pride Parade and you see all these floats, the Bank of Montreal, TD Bank. Those people are not the friends of the workers of this country. They're using the LGBTQ community cynically in order to burnish their progressive credentials.
I'll reinforce your point, actually, if you don't mind my interrupting. Just
Sure.
briefly. Very brief. What you say is absolutely right, because I remember thinking this back in it must have been the mid to late 90s when we had the Egan and Nesbitt case. So what that shows, because already by then Canada was the champion of LGBTQ community and blah blah and so on. But when it came to giving money, so the Egan and Nesbitt case was a case where two gay men who were married, and then one of them passed away, and the surviving spouse essentially said that he should be entitled to the same pension rights as female spouses of men were, and the Supreme Court granted that from the point of view of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, that the surviving spouse was entitled to this, but then the Supreme Court claimed that it would be too expensive, so it wasn't going to grant it. So this shows you that when it comes to spending, actually putting money behind your words, behind your promises, the Canadian establishment, including the Supreme Court, gives you nothing. It doesn't matter what group you belong to. You can be a woman, you can be LGBTQ, you can be a non-white person. They will promise you everything so long as it costs nothing.
Right. In other words, so long as it preserves the power and privilege of the wealthy.
Exactly.
That's it. So they have no problem being quote unquote progressive as long as you don't touch their power and privilege.
Yes.
So and we've a lot of us have fallen for this in this country. They fall for the shtick. At the end of the day, if you're not prepared to redistribute wealth massively, you aren't a friend of the working class. Period. End of story. No matter what language you may employ,
yes.
No matter what policies you may pursue. And the other thing I want to say, which is addresses a point that you made at the outset. You referred to Poilievre as a Trumpist candidate. Now, in many respects, that's absolutely true. But there's one key respect in which I think that's not true. And that is Trump, I believe, will pursue, to the exclusion of everything else in his presidency, what he perceives to be the national interest. Now, I'm not saying that his perception of the U.S. national interest is correct. I'm not saying that it accords with the interests of the American people. I'm not saying that at all. But he has a certain conception of what is good for America, and he's going to prioritize that over all else. Poilievre isn't going to do that. Poilievre is going to do what Trump wants him to do. He's going to be every bit the vassal of Washington that Justin Trudeau was, and possibly even worse in that regard. So in that sense, he's not Trumpist. He's not going to be a nationalist. I think what he's going to be is a servant of Washington, but he'll clothe it up in the language of Canadian patriotism and so forth. He'll try to exploit patriotic fervor in this country. But he's not going to change the fundamental orientation of Canadian foreign policy. Canadian foreign policy will continue to accord with the bidding of Washington. Whatever Washington wants, Poilievre is going to give them. I have every confidence that that is going to happen. So in that sense, he's not really a nationalist. He's not really a Trumpist. We in this country are falling into a state of, I talked about this on a recent program, Reason to Resist, where I think that really this whole discussion around Trump wanting to convert Canada into the 51st state has an air of unreality to it, because in many ways we already are the 51st state.
That's such an interesting point, because I was looking at it from a slightly different point of view, but I think our conclusions are very compatible. Because I thought, okay, so because, Trump said he's going to he said Governor Trudeau and 51st state and whatnot. And then, of course, all the major politicians came out and said, oh, this is wrong. This is not going to happen. But it's almost as though Trump said it so that they can claim for public consumption how, that this is not going to happen and we are so patriotic, etc. So this will impress the public. Everybody will think that they are essentially looking after the interests of Canadians, while they will actually then be freer to do what Trump wants them to do. So in that sense, you and I came to this very similar conclusion from two different points of view. But certainly, in my view, I would say that certainly by the time we signed the US-Canada Free Trade Agreement back in 1998, that Canadians have essentially, hitched their wagon to the United States rather than doing what so many progressive economists had been saying, diversifying our trading links, exploring, on both Atlantic and Pacific sides of our country, different trade relations and economic relations. And we can still do that, but we are not doing that. And I agree with you. I think this is what exactly these people will do. And of course,
I crunched some numbers, Radhika, recently. The trade with the United States amounts to, I think in 2024, 2023, about $909 billion, almost $1 trillion. And that constitutes somewhere in the range of 43% of Canada's annual GDP.
Yes.
The U.S., even though we are at or near the top of the U.S.'s biggest trading partners, U.S. trade with Canada accounts for something like 13.6% of American GDP. So the United States would be affected to a far lesser extent by a total breakdown in trading relations with Canada than Canada would be affected by that breakdown. Canada's now become extraordinarily vulnerable to adverse trade measures adopted by the U.S. government. They are much less vulnerable to us. And so naturally, this is going to place us in a position of subservience to Washington. And we saw this in, Technicolor when Trump started threatening, to slap Canada with 25% tariffs if it didn't militarize the border, which is essentially what Trudeau agreed to do. How did Trudeau react? He got on a plane and fled to Mar-a-Lago. where he promised Trump everything that he wanted. Then he came back and he announced with great fanfare this new border protection initiative, which was suitably monikered with a militaristic sounding word. He called it the Joint Strike Force. This is exactly the language that Trump wanted to hear. He wants a militarized border. Trudeau dutifully said, snapped at attention, said, yes, sir, we'll give that to you. And even, Doug Ford, who I think was kind of, reading the tea leaves here, but my sense was that he and Trudeau, who, despite their supposed political differences, seemed to get along famously, that he was assigned the task of being the bad cop. And so he went on American television, Doug Ford, and Canadian television, and was saying, we're going to retaliate, we're going to fight back, maybe we're going to cut off the oil. That was all nonsense, because Doug Ford ultimately agreed to step in and also help militarize the border. It was just a show. And then you have Danielle Smith in Alberta, who wasn't even putting on a show. She says, whatever Mr. Trump wants, we're going to give to him. There's absolutely no way that we're going to reduce our shipments of oil to the United States. So I think this whole sorry episode, in a way, I think Trump did us a favor by threatening, because it really highlighted the degree to which the Canadian political elite is subservient to Washington. And I hope that, our fellow Canadians got the memo.
Well, I hope so, because, in fact, when you said Trudeau rushed to Mar-a-Lago, and I actually had a very vivid image in my mind about, when Trudeau did this, what is this guy doing? And I refrained from using it in my written piece, but I'm going to say it here. Trudeau essentially ran over to Trump, rolled over on his belly and asked Trump to rub it. Basically, that's what happened. I mean, it's like that's what dogs do when they are being very subservient. So that's exactly what Trudeau did. And I think that so, whether Trump did us a favor, did the Canadians a favor, or Trump did the elites a favor, because you're saying Trump did us a favor because we should be able to see exactly how subservient the Canadian elites are, main party elites. And I'm saying that Trump is giving them a cover. Either way, for some, maybe
well, it wasn't
right.
an intentional favor. Yeah, it was
whatever. For some
favor.
Canadians, you will be right, and for other Canadians, maybe I'll be right. But this is very interesting. And I also wanted to go back to you were talking about Carney and Freeland as the two most serious candidates, and they, we have known this for a long time. So, Freeland, it's very interesting. If Freeland becomes the leader, I mean, if Carney, let me just say, first of all, if Carney becomes the leader, it will just be more of the same. That is to say that the Liberal Party will remain in the same mode. And it's therefore not surprising that Trudeau tried to shift aside Chrystia Freeland and appoint Carney as the finance minister, which of course prompted Chrystia Freeland's resignation. But essentially, Carney will do more of the same. What do I mean by that? Carney has been an expert at pursuing neoliberal policies while sort of saying his heart bleeds for, suffering and ordinary people and so on. So he essentially talks about how, we can pursue progressive climate policies and so on, which are really just window dressing for underlying policies, which are simply, they don't care about the climate except to make a show of things. So that's Carney for you. And Carney, of course, has been, as you say, the Governor General the governor of both the Bank of Canada and of the Bank of England, which is also really, it sort of puts him into that Atlanticist circle of elites where, he is, au fait with all those elites. Now, Freeland is slightly different material. I would say that, as we know, and I don't think I'm stepping out of line in any way by pointing out that if Chrystia Freeland is the granddaughter of Ukrainian Nazis, and she has never forsaken this relationship. I mean, I don't blame anybody for who their parents or grandparents were. We can't help it. But at the very least, as a politician who claims to be a progressive, she could have distanced herself from this. Who claims to be fighting for democracy could have distanced herself from this, but she never did that. And therefore, and of course, as we know, Canada has historically played the role of training and now even assisting and funding a Ukrainian government which is significantly backed by Nazi and neo-Nazi outfits, anti-military units are created by that, and the Canadian government has contributed to training them in the past, even as mainstream sources, this is before the onset of the Russian operations there, even at a time when mainstream Western outfits like BBC Newsnight and other such, Time magazine and so on, were doing videos about Ukraine's Nazi problem. So you can see these videos, or at least you could a year or so ago when I first looked at them. So in that sense, I think that Freeland will likely bring the Liberal Party even closer to the present hard right Conservative Party under Pierre Poilievre as a kind of way of winning the war. And of course, as you know, in her resignation letter, she pointed out that she was concerned that Trudeau was spending too much money and not keeping the fiscal powder dry. Now, of course, I admit that the points she was referring to were really cheap tricks that Trudeau was playing by giving people a GST holiday for Christmas. I mean, and a $250 check. Like, what kind of a idiocy is that? But nevertheless, that's what Trudeau elected to do. That's what Trudeau is. Certainly, Chrystia Freeland is smarter, but smarter in a darker way than you and I would like to see, and most Canadians would like to see. So this is also really quite fascinating. And a final point, maybe, and maybe I'll just make this a question to you. Really, I see Trudeau's fault, as I said in my opening remarks, Trudeau's fall, as I said in my opening remarks, as really something that is happening across the Western world, where the globalist, Atlanticist, so-called democratic Bidenite side is falling, and a new Trumpist side might win. What do you think of that?
I'm sorry, you broke up there for a moment. Could you repeat the question? Apologies.
Let me repeat that. So I think that essentially, what the Trudeau's fall in his resignation might be seen as as the latest of a series of Western so-called democratic, Atlanticist, Bidenite, globalist side to fall. Like Trudeau is the latest of this tribe. Others were Scholz and Macron's Prime Minister Barnier and Wu Yun and so on. But others are also in trouble. So do you see that this is some kind of an internationally coordinated fall of a certain vision and a certain way of doing politics in the West? It was not great, but we are probably looking at something even more right-wing, harder, but whatever you may think.
Well, I think there's tremendous overlap for the reasons behind the fall of all of these people.
Yes.
If that's what you mean by coordinated, I don't think that there's some sort of, somebody behind the scenes orchestrating all of this, like these people are marionettes necessarily. But what is happening is that throughout the West, there is a profound discontent with the model of governance and the economic and foreign policies of these Atlanticists. And that is being roundly rejected. The problem that we're experiencing is that people are, and this is because of the manipulation, I think largely because of the manipulation by the corporate media. People are choosing the wrong alternative to replace it. They're misdiagnosing the problem, and we're going to end up exacerbating the situation and not finding the cure for the sickness. But are the reasons for the demise of the Scholz government, Macron's selection for prime minister, the conservatives in Britain, Trudeau and so forth, Biden, are they very similar? Absolutely. There's tremendous similarity. These people are fundamentally serving the interests of the corporate elite. They're serving a hegemonic agenda. And all of this is exacerbating the problems being experienced on a day-to-day basis by ordinary citizens, and particularly the poor and the working class. And so, but they are opting for the wrong alternative. I completely agree. I do want to say a few additional things about Chrystia Freeland. I regard Chrystia Freeland as a very dangerous individual. It's not just that she didn't distance herself from her grandfather, who was clearly a Nazi collaborator. I would say an outright Nazi. That's what the evidence shows. She called him a champion of democracy.
Wow.
It's one thing to say, I'm not going to renounce my grandfather, but to positively misrepresent to such an extraordinary degree what he was, to call him a champion of democracy when he was a Nazi or a Nazi collaborator is outrageous. And she accused those who told the truth about her grandfather of being agents of the Russian government. She smeared them. And then she gave two standing ovations to another outright Ukrainian Nazi in Canada's parliament. At the time when she was probably the second most powerful person in the Canadian government. And as the Ottawa Citizen exposed, the Canadian military was training neo-Nazis in the Ukrainian military. And she has, she was at a protest. She was caught holding a scarf, which was associated with the Ukrainian far right, and she deleted a photograph that she had posted on X of her holding that scarf after the anti-imperialist community erupted in furor. So this is a person who has very hard right political orientation. Chrystia Freeland. All the evidence indicates that. And I fear for what this country would become under Chrystia Freeland. I think from a foreign policy perspective, she's every bit as dangerous as Pierre Poilievre, and she could even be more dangerous than Pierre Poilievre. But at the end of the day, this is no kind of person to appoint to solve the problems of this country. Mark Carney is, fundamentally, the man's a banker. And he's going to pursue policies that are going to be in the interests of the financial elite. I think that should be assumed. And if we're going to get out of this vicious cycle, Radhika, which is leading to increasing levels of anger and frustration in the population, with potentially disastrous consequences down the road for what remains of Canadian democracy, we have to stop replacing failed prime ministers like Justin Trudeau with people like Mark Carney and Chrystia Freeland. This is exactly the opposite of what we need in order to set our democracy on the right path.
Yeah, just a couple of points there, and we should probably wind down soon because we're kind of coming close to an hour. But let me just, what you said really reminds me of a couple of things that both about Carney Trudeau and about Freeland. So let me just say on Carney Trudeau, I mean, the fact is, Trudeau, when Trudeau was in 2015, it wasn't that Trudeau was regarded as this great prime ministerial figure and, rose from the ranks to lead the Liberal Party. No, a Liberal team got together. The Liberal team consisted of grandees like Ralph Goodale and David Dodge and whoever. And of course, with the addition of young new stars like Chrystia Freeland, who had just joined the Liberal Party a few years before, they got together and decided that we are going to make one big push to revive the fortunes of the Liberal Party, which had sunk to an all-time low in the previous election. And they then, having come up with a set of plans, come up with a set of promises to make to the Canadian public, which of course they intended completely to betray, but then is decided to front themselves with Justin Trudeau. What's nicer than Justin Trudeau? Justin Trudeau used to be dismissed as prime ministerial material because he said things like, I don't read newspapers. I'm sure if something important happens, somebody will tell me. So he would say things like that. So of course, nobody took him seriously. But now that a group of other clever people had put together a clever plan for the betrayal of Canada, what was nicer than to front it with Justin Trudeau? People were reminded of the most iconic prime minister Canada ever had. Of course, he's a bit Marmite, as they say in England. That is to say, you either like him a lot or you hate him. But nevertheless, Pierre Elliott, nevertheless, it worked, So Trudeau, who's like essentially a pretty face for this nasty program, was, essentially that. Mark Carney is, got a few more brain cells than Trudeau. And so he will be much more of an actor on his own accord, but that will be the only difference between them.
Yes, yes.
As for Freeland, I remember thinking way back when the entire parliament, consisting of every last, 300 plus members of the Canadian parliament, stood up and applauded a Nazi. And I mean, the whole country was shocked. Like, did not even one of them, these supposedly very highly educated people, did not even one of them have the temerity to ask, well, hang on, if he was fighting against the Russians in the Second World War, which is why we are applauding him, who was he fighting for? And if they had merely asked that question, they would have known the answer. But nobody did. The entire parliament, which is no more than a herd of sheep, even probably sheep have more independence than they do, they all stood up and applauded. And I think this is, of course, and I think you're right, Chrystia Freeland is the one who engineered this. We were told that, oh, Anthony Rota, the Speaker of the Canadian Parliament, made a mistake and he therefore fell on his sword and resigned and whatnot. Nothing doing. It wasn't Rota who invited him. Such an invitation would have never gone out without the complicity and probably the initiative of the government. Chrystia Freeland, in addition to being who she is, which we've already talked about, has a PhD in Russian and Slavic studies, or anyway, a postgraduate degree in Russian and Slavic studies. She knows what she's talking about. She was not trying to, just like this was not a mistake. She was actively trying to push the envelope of what the Canadian public will accept. If they accept that it was okay to be a Nazi if you were fighting the Russians, that is another step in favor of making people like her grandfather, and for that matter herself, acceptable to the Canadian public. And I think this is what she was really doing. And I'm so thankful that they failed, because as I was pilloried in the press for asking a question about this to President Putin at the Valdai Club meetings. And I got, of course, a lot of hate mail on the social media, but I don't have much of a social media presence. So I also got emails, personal emails, but I have to report, I also got a lot of love mail. People writing to me saying things like, you know what, my father/grandfather who fought in the Second World War must be turning around in his grave to see what happened in the Canadian Parliament. And they would absolutely be right. And people who said you did the right thing and so on. So anyway, to come back to this point, I mean, I completely agree with you that Chrystia Freeland is a much more dangerous figure. And maybe, we can end this discussion by bringing by bringing it around to the whole, we are calling this group the Atlanticist establishment, the so-called democratic into heavy quotation marks establishment, the globalist establishment, because these are all words they use for themselves and so on. But exactly what these people are, because it seems to me that essentially what happened is that sometime in the late 90s or mid to late 90s, when people like Clinton and Blair came to power, it became a trend to hide the neoliberalism behind a veneer of tokenistic progressivism. And this kind of seemed to work for a while. But by the 2010s, it was no longer working. And the sign that it was no longer working was the Boris Johnson's successful campaign for Brexit in 2016, and then in the same year, the election of Donald Trump. And so we began to see that the hypocrisy of this Atlanticist democratic group so-called progressive group was essentially becoming the highway along which a brazen right-wing force was advancing. And that's what we are seeing. And of course, then in the context of the conflict in Ukraine after February 2022, what began to happen is that, because, I want to go back to this whole idea of, what is the international connection? And I'm open, like I'm just speculating here. And you also gave some thoughts, but maybe we'll end with this and your thoughts on this, that essentially with the onset of this conflict in Ukraine, military conflict in Ukraine in 2022, what you began to see is that the that Biden made a great effort to essentially rally the allies. Everybody step in line. We are all going to work as one. We are going to create the greatest unity that the Western world has ever had, NATO has ever had, etc., etc. And of course, it was kind of lucky for Biden that all the major governments in all the major countries of the Western Alliance were essentially people who are willing to play along with Biden, probably having been through various, global leadership schools run by American government and so on. They were products of all that. So they were happy to go along with that. And we are now also, and they were definitely coordinated. They talk to one another. They act as an international alliance. But of course, the Trumpists are also increasingly acting as an international alliance, funnily enough, so that, Trump or Musk can say, the AFD will save Germany, or in the case of Britain, Trump and Musk and others can take a side in favor of the Reform Party, which is led by Nigel Farage, although they don't like Nigel Farage, whatever. So talk about international interference in politics, but maybe we can end, Dimitri, with some thoughts from you about these things.
Well, there's no question that there's international coordination going on at the level of this so-called this faux populist movement of the right. So, for example, we've seen Elon Musk, who gave massive amounts of money to the Trump campaign, is now a part of the Trump team, openly promoting the far right racist fanatical Zionist Tommy Robinson to replace Nigel Farage. Nigel Farage is too moderate for Elon Musk, and he's openly interfering in British politics to promote this odious character, Tommy Robinson, who's actually done jail time. Okay, and he's now, as we all know, he has been promoting openly and explicitly and aggressively the AfD in Germany. So there's absolutely no question that there's a coordination going on internationally, and it's dangerously effective, I think. They're strengthening each other's movements in these various countries. One thing I will say about this movement, however, although I am implacably opposed to it for a whole host of reasons, which we've been discussing, there are indications, including the fact that Trump apparently shut down the assault on Gaza simply by sending his envoy, Steve Witkoff, to browbeat Netanyahu. And some of the talk we're hearing about from the Trump administration about ending the Ukraine war, that there is within elements of this movement a recognition of the limits of their power. And maybe they are more, we'll see, but they may be more prepared to accommodate the era of multipolarity than the neoliberal elite is. They are not prepared to accommodate it at all. Now, it's not because people like Trump or Musk or the leader of the AfD are humanitarians. It's not for that reason. It's not because they're Democrats. They're none of those things. Certainly, they're not progressive. The reason is simply that there is an element, perhaps, hopefully, of realism in terms of the reach of the power of Western governments. So that maybe something good will emerge from it relative to what we've been experiencing for most of our adult lives. But Radhika, at the end of the day, if we don't address and don't put into power people who are going to address the structural inequities of our society, our situation is only going to get worse. Our politics are going to get worse. Instability is going to get worse, and popular discontent is going to get worse.
Absolutely.
So the last thing I want to say, just to because I think it's an anecdote that really sheds a lot of light on the reality of what we're dealing with here in Canada. You talked about how Trudeau was this vacuous character who didn't have a lot of substance, but ultimately presented well, and that's why they empowered him. As a matter of fact, I used to work closely with somebody who served as the president of the Liberal Party. I won't name the person, but we talked enough and worked enough together that I sometimes got insights into this person's views about Liberal Party politics. And back in the months leading up to Justin Trudeau's decision to run to be the leader of the Liberal Party, so this would have been back around 2012, 2013, We had an enlightening conversation, and I asked him, "What do you think about this young Trudeau? You know, and do you think he's the right man for the job?" And he said to me, "Dimitri, I have two words for you: empty suit." And he walked. And I'm here to tell you that Pierre Poilievre, you could just as aptly describe him in that way. He is the conservative version of an empty suit. The man has absolutely no substance. He has a certain presentation, a certain appearance, which is deemed by the real elite, the real power within the Conservative Party, to secure the prime ministership for the Conservative Party, to secure power for the Conservative Party. But this is a person with absolutely no intellectual depth whatsoever. Not only is he morally bankrupt, but he has the intellectual substance of an empty suit. So hopefully, enough Canadians will realize that between now and election day to affect real change in this country.
Well,
I don't have a lot of hope for that,
I was
but
going to give you the last word until you said, well, at the point where you said empty suit about Trudeau. But I would say, I suspect, I wish you were right about Poilievre, but I think that he does have some smarts. I mean, I'm not saying that he's really, I mean, at the end of the day, if you are as nasty as Pierre Poilievre is, there must be something wrong with you. So, in that sense, but I think he has a certain level of shrewdness, and that is going to be, I think, a lot more dangerous than Trudeau. Not that Trudeau has not been dangerous for us; he has put us in a lot of danger on a number of counts. For example, arresting Meng Wanzhou and destroying our relationship with China, which is in many ways a very important country that we must relate to. But anyway, there are so many things that you raise. The limitations of American power. By God, we could have another whole conversation about it. I hope you'll come back, Dimitri, to discuss this, or for that matter, the many other things that you cover on your wonderful YouTube website, YouTube channel, Reason to Resist, including, of course, Israel, Gaza, Palestine, Middle East, etc., which you do so well, particularly given that we are told, and we hope it's true, that there will be a ceasefire beginning in Gaza tomorrow. So let's hope for that. Let's wish for that. And thank you so much. And we hope to have you back very soon. Goodbye.
my pleasure. Happy to be back. Take care, Radhika.
Great.